So my name is José Zagal. I'm faculty at DePaul University, and I'm also visiting at the University of Utah, where I teach in the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program, EAE, right here. A couple of weeks ago, Malcolm sent me an email saying, hey, so what's your title and your abstract? And I didn't know what I was going to talk about, so I sent him a title which I thought was provocative without having any idea what I was going to talk about. But, you know, I think that there is something to be said for sort of being put under pressure. And also I realized that I would be going last in the program. So rather than try to sort of give a very specific, focused talk, I thought I'd try to do something a bit broader and bring us up a little bit. So I started from this phrase of hell and thinking of how did that relate to video games. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the phrase, this comes from, attributed to General Sherman. We saw his picture earlier today. Basically, he's the one who supposedly said this multiple times or on different occasions giving speeches after the US Civil War. And if anyone knows about war being hell, General Sherman would be a great example because he was both famous and infamous in US history, depending on which side of the country you're on, for some of his acts that he undertook during the war. So for example, he's famous for having captured Atlanta, and for then kicking out all the civilians and burning the city to the ground. And from then on, he practiced what we would now call scorched earth tactics, as he sort of drove his army to the sea towards Savannah. And so there's this notion of, yes, war is hell, but you were also the one who was sort of making that happen by targeting, you know, not killing civilians explicitly, but targeting basically civilian infrastructure or military infrastructure and trying to destroy sort of the economy and the will of the southern population as a way to end the war. So if you go back to this question of, from an ethical perspective, you know, if war is really bad, and where does that put video games about war? And it seems to me that it's an easy question because with war games, you get all the good things. You get fun and excitement and adrenaline, you get to feel powerful, but you don't get any of the bad things. You don't get the fear, the anguish, the pain, the cost of destruction, the horror that you do get with actual war. So I'm sort of in an impasse here. I'm saying that video games are really bad because you only get the good things, none of the bad things. And I'm a supporter of video games, and so what am I doing here? Which is sort of a bit tricky and then maybe a bit simplistic, to be fair. But I think what we do need to think about is this question of this balance. How do we think about games of war more broadly and what is happening there and the relationship to war itself? We can think in terms of benefits and drawbacks and then maybe try to get some sort of balance of these two things. But I think perhaps more interestingly, we should look at this intersection, right? If we have war and everything we know about war, and we have ethics and everything we know about ethics, and we could call the intersection, you know, war ethics, but then we also have video games, and they're overlapping in different ways. So today I'm hoping to give us a sense of what it means for a game to be a war game, and maybe point out some initial ideas on kind of what are the issues and what are the things we should be thinking about, talking about when we look at these specific games. So I'll briefly do this. This was fortunately covered earlier. Ethics of war, basically, pacifism is unfortunately a minority view historically. This is the idea that basically, yes, there is such a thing as an ethical war. This idea of just war theory, correct me if I'm wrong, I think began with St. Thomas Aquinas, who basically noted this idea that a just war needs to meet certain conditions declared by a legitimate authority, the prince or, you know, the royalty or whatever. There must be a just cause over which this war is being waged, and it must be fought in a way that is just as well. And I think if we keep these three things in mind and we look at games, we might notice interesting areas that have been sort of left out that we haven't talked about, and might give us a different perspective on talking about ethics of war games specifically. So what is a game of war? Wiktionary came to the rescue here. Draw your attention to the second definition there, a game that simulates or represents a military operation. I would like to offer a third definition, perhaps slightly broader, a game where war and or military operations are simulated or represented. And you'll see why I'm going for that definition in just a few minutes. So in articulating this intersection between war and video games and ethics as well, I thought there were 5 sort of key things to look at. And we'll go over each of these in order. So first, let's talk about granularity of the human personal experience. So there are lots of games where you play as a soldier and you fight, and that's what you do. There's lots of games that are also war games where you play as sort of the pilot or the captain, and you're now in a vehicle. So maybe you're sort of slightly removed from this very direct personal experience. And there's lots of games where you're in a different role altogether. You're the commander. You're the one who's giving others orders, or presumably giving instructions to go out and fight battles and do things. And I think there's a different layers here, and there are different issues at each of these layers, and for sure some games move between them at different points in time. But this is the idea that if you're the soldier, it's you, or it's someone that you're very close to, so maybe these kinds of experiences are more personal. If you're the commander, you're sort of further removed from the battlefield and from the choices that are being made. So perhaps the more personal experiences are interesting because they might lead to more emotional or empathetic experiences as well. There's something we know games can do pretty well. They can get us all excited and so on. But we can also see that the spectrum is very narrow. It goes up and down, but it is still mostly limited only to military. So war affects everyone, we know that. And so we sort of ask ourselves, well, what about everybody else? And there are too few exceptions, would be my claim here. And sure, you can play as children refugees in Darfur is Dying. You can play as civilians in This War of Mine. You can play a nurse in Valiant Hearts, which I recently finished as well. So we are starting to see games that are exploring these other roles or other people, other populations that are affected by war, not just sort of the soldier, the grunt, the commander, and so on. And to be clear also, even though you might be really removed, I'm not saying that these kinds of experiences can't be effective in generating sort of emotional impact or connection. And I think here, DEF CON is a great example of taking this abstraction really high, but still creating an experience that is interesting and engaging. Miguel Sicart talks a lot about DEF CON in his book, and I encourage you to look up as well. This sort of notion that when you realize it's millions and billions of people that you're talking about and lives being wiped out, even in an interface which is very reminiscent of the sort of abstract view of the Cold War, very sort of I'm in the bunker, in the war room, and so on, you can still get that feeling of, well, what have I done? You don't need to see dead bodies or know the names of the soldiers and so on. Okay, so let's talk about scope and scale. I think there's another interesting consideration. So war games, we go from different ends as well. So there are games where it's about the battles. It's, here I am shooting my gun at you and you're on the other side, and at the end of the day we'll call it the Battle of the Hill or whatever it was. To campaigns, maybe a collection of battles, and to an entire war, and sometimes that scale might be, the war itself might be the minimum unit, right? And I think it's interesting to consider that as well, because again, the ethical issues are different, and you do get different experiences as a player from these as well. So we could say perhaps the same thing, it's a human personal scale, but when we talk about at the war level, it is about a society, right? And I think it was interesting from the previous talk, where we're talking about an entire civilization. You call the game Civilization, but it's about getting rid of civilizations, and it's about eliminating them, and there's no impact then. You can't, we can talk today about civilizations that no longer exist, but we are able to trace their influence on us and ideas and culture and so on. In games, this is sort of completely erased. You don't get to say, yes, thanks to the Mayans, we have the wheel or whatever, because no, they're just gone. They're completely erased from the game, which is not the case in real life. And I think if we consider the impact that war has at these different levels, we also make different choices and different decisions. Okay, so I'd say this matters because, again, these different scales have different ethical concerns and ramifications. And it's whether I decide to lie or steal or kill someone is very different from if I decide to wipe out another civilization, or how do I assimilate them or not, and what are the ethical considerations there, and so on. Okay, we also see that most cases games are showing the during. So you're in the war that's already started, and the game ends, and the war hasn't ended necessarily either. There's little questioning of what happened before. Was this a just war, for example? And very few considerations of what happens afterwards. How do you sort of mop up, or how do you sort of make right what happened during? I think there are a lot of games where the role that war plays is also a moving target. Most games, yes, war is the whole point. I'm playing World of Warcraft. War is in the title. That's the whole idea, right? But it's not always the case. And I think it's important to look at games where war happens and to understand how it is framed and situated. So there's a lot of games where war is, I like to think of it as an event in a timeline. You're playing the game and you move it on, and then boom, all of a sudden, Gandhi declares war on you. And if you guys are familiar with the series, he will most likely use his nuclear weapons if he has them. And this is sort of a bug that was kept in the game because people thought it was so interesting that Gandhi, this pacifist, is always the one who uses the nukes against you. So in the case of a game like Civilization, when you were at war, when you're not at war, it's a transient period that you experience during the game. And lots of sort of Civilization-style grand strategy games tend to have this kind of a perspective of war. It's a choice you make. I will now go to war to obtain something, or it's something that happens to me. Somebody declared war on me, and how do I deal with that? But I also think it's an interesting space in large-scale MMOs where here's an actual group of players that might decide as a community to engage in these activities. EVE Online is perhaps one of the more notable ones because it really is an open world, and suddenly, wars have been started in EVE Online over stupid things such as I forgot to pay my internet bill, or I was on the toilet when something was happening, I didn't click, and then everybody sort of jumps in, and you end up these sort of massive wars happening in this world where people are talking about how much was lost. There's $2 million worth of ships destroyed in the Battle of Jita or whatever it was. So I think there's an interesting question that's like, well, what does this war mean in this context when a group of players decide to do this, right? Okay. There's also games where war is the background or the backdrop. And I think here sometimes, for example, a game like Assassin's Creed, which is set against the backdrop of the American Revolutionary War, it provides a context for interesting things to happen. Rules, your typical rules of society or laws are sort of suspended because you're at war and things are special. But it can also serve as sort of motivators or triggers to get a story started. Dante's Inferno is an interesting game, and it is triggered by the actions that the protagonist takes during the Third Crusade. And it sort of questions the right of the crusade, was it a just war, and so on. And you basically spend the whole game sort of paying or trying to atone for the sins caused in that sort of very initial scene of the game. So war, I think, it provides interesting setting or context in which to create other kinds of gameplay experiences that might not be about war, but you can see how they're connected to war and get us thinking about these kinds of activities. So even though fighting ethically is important, a lot of times is how it's started or who's doing the fighting or what's going on can be just as interesting to explore in games. I'd like to see more of that. And this notion of examining the broader context of war, I think, is also interesting. So we focus a lot on the sort of face-to-face violence. We talk about shooters and shooting people in the face, but war, the big picture, I think, is a different perspective that we do need to look at. Type of military, here's, I think, perhaps a criticism maybe of the current games industry, but I sort of, 4 different types of military I've seen sort of in different games. So regular military, the one you're familiar with, but we have these other 3 types, which are interesting because they feel very much like military or presented in a context that seems military. But I think we need to start wondering about these contexts and questioning them. So maybe most games are up here, but if you take take games like Homefront or Freedom Fighters or The Saboteur, you're playing as an irregular here. And depending on the perspective, you're a terrorist or you're an insurgent, and the kinds of activities that you do and how do you regulate your behavior as a player in this. Like, is it okay to do anything because we were invaded and now we need to fight back against the North Koreans in the case of Homefront? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to start to discuss these issues and discuss how they are presented in the games by the industry. So you're presented like, we're freedom fighters, we're the military. But no, you're not. If you were the Soviets in the case of freedom fighters, you're the terrorists. And we should, squash you and send out drone strikes to take you out and so on. You're not the sort of the champions of liberty because you've been invaded, you lost. Like, give up, come on, stop fighting. So we tend to romanticize a lot of the behaviors in these kinds of games, right? We seem like you're doing the right thing and fighting for your rights and so on, but we never talk about the ethics of these kinds of activities, right? We also see a lot of games where what I would call like regular security issues are dealt with or presented in a context which is highly militarized. Right. So yes, it's okay for you to be in Las Vegas and doing all these kinds of things which you only see in the movies. But this is sort of the regular fare of these kinds of units in this game, where you basically say, hey, it's okay to have a full-blown military operation on U.S. soil in a regular situation in a big city full of tourists. Right. Which is something that now in the States, you're starting to see the media sort of question some of this. If you think about Ferguson and the police response there, they're talking about this issue, well, are you serving and protecting, or are we the enemy? Like, we the civilians, are we the enemy? And I think we see some of this in games, and maybe we need to question it a bit more. Even this notion of sort of the covert or the black ops. And I think it's interesting that here's 2 games in a very popular series that are basically dedicated to doing all kinds of illegal things that you shouldn't be doing in the first place and that you're not allowed to talk about, and that's why they're called black ops. And they're sort of legitimizing these kinds of activities, and we don't really question too much. I mean, this game is called Just Cause, and it's basically about destabilizing an existing government in order to implant a different one. And we can argue about, well, is it fair to destabilize an existing government? How did this government get to be there? And so on. And so it's interesting how these things are sort of spun or presented in a context which is still a war context. But in this case, it's the cause is just enough that the means, who cares about the means, right? It's the ends that sort of matter. So I think for these, if we think of these types of military as standalone units, and that is highly arguable, We could argue that each of these groups also has different ethical requirements, or different ethical challenges that they must face. And too often they're sort of swept under the rug or under the big rug of, hey, this is all military, so let's just look at war ethics and so on. Okay. So these ethical concerns, which vary from group to group, are often not really considered or not really discussed or presented in any sort of meaningful fashion. And finally, there's this notion of realism and authenticity. This has come up in some of the talks today. And I think the key point here to remember is if we think of games as simulations, and that's already perhaps arguable for many of us, we need to then understand that simulators are less than reality, sort of by definition, right? And so there's this question of what should you include and what should you not include. And asking those questions about what is necessary, what is the minimum necessary, what is fair to not put in, and what is fair to put in, relates to some of these issues of realism and authenticity. I mean, I think an interesting case here is Full Spectrum Warrior, for which authenticity was a selling point. So this was a game that was developed first for the military, and then they came out with a commercial release. And you can ask questions, well, was this propaganda? And neat thing to know is that there are differences. So when the retail version came out, quickly people discovered there was a cheat code that sort of unlocked the military version of the game. And all players thought, oh, the military version is a lot more interesting, a lot more fun, because it was a lot harder. So there were more civilians in the military version of the game. Civilians interacted with the player in a greater variety of ways. In the commercial version, civilians were basically always hostile towards you, either in what they said to you, like, oh, go home, American, we don't like you here, or outright sort of violent. But in the military version of the game, you had to discriminate. There were some civilians who were like, hey, how's it going? You didn't know, ooh, is that an insurgent? Or do they have, an AK-47, hiding behind the camel or whatever? So these differences, basically, you think of the military version as being the more directed at seeing the local population as the enemy, but it was actually the commercial version that did that. And so in this case, it was realistic in the sense of command structure and the equipment that is being used, but not realistic in the sense of the context in which the fighting was taking place. And the military one was more so. There's also a Red Cross study that is looked at, and this was also mentioned earlier, that sort of looked at are war crimes punishable or not and how they represented different games. I think we also need to remember there's a lot of games which are realistic or authentic in their historical sense. And here, we can think of these as opportunities to study and understand and learn about not only history, but also sort of military and history and how military actions throughout history have changed where we are today. So there's a lot of these Europa Universalis games, for example, and Civilization have been used in educational settings and contexts where, for example, Kurt Squire did a study a couple of years ago where he had disenfranchised students play Civilization, and the Native American students were, for me, it was the most interesting because they really enjoyed the game because for them, it gave them an opportunity to subvert the narrative that they were getting in regular school. So when they go to school, they're hearing about the pilgrims and the people that came over from Europe to save the day and bring technology and advancement and so on. And they're saying, yeah, right, and also kill all my family, right? And everybody that lived here and raise my culture and so on. I get to play this game and I get to do that to you, right? I get to see that, you know what? We didn't lose because we were sucky or because we were terrible or because we were wrong. We just lost because there's all these other factors that now I understand when I play the game, right? Sure, we had worse technology, but maybe if we had been organized differently, we could have done this or this could have happened. So I get as a player a chance to turn the tables and say, you know what? If we had done this, we would have won. It's not that we lost because we weren't better, right? And this sort of is very empowering for these students or these people. So I think these kind of historical games give us that opportunity. There's also a lot of games that are speculative. They're thinking of, and this goes back to the tradition of strategy games, strategy board games, and war games, where, I wonder if Rommel could have won that battle if he had done something differently, right? If he had done what I think was the ideal thing. And so it's an opportunity to study, in some cases, the future as well, and think of, well, how could we avoid doing something? How could we do this, achieve our goals with the least effort, least cost, least damage, and so on. So I think a lot of games also give us the opportunity to explore those kinds of things. So accuracy is really part of the story, right? If we think about authenticity, we think about issues that are not just about the fighting and not just about casualties or dying and so on. We can understand war in this context, its effects over time, its effects on society, on places, and so on. And we can ask different kinds of questions of war and of the role that war has in our culture and in society. So And also to be clear, all these issues apply even to those games that are by definition not realistic, right? These are fantastical, imaginary games, but also war games. And sometimes these contexts, which are imaginary, might be even more productive for some of these things, right? Just to face a situation where the enemy is, humanity really is about to be exterminated. And that brings into question new issues and concerns and what kind of actions are acceptable and so on. There's even games where this notion of war is the anti-goal. Balance of Power is perhaps one of the more notable examples where basically if you get to a point where there is war, you lose. And so the question is, well, how can I solve this problem to not get to nuclear war? Nuclear war is really the lose state in this game. Peacemaker, I think, is another nice example of that too, where here's a complicated problem where you don't want to avoid war, where war is always the easiest solution, but is the least valuable or least or the worst one, right? And so how do you navigate this really complicated territory to not get to war? I think is another perspective that we could look at. So here's 5 different ideas on articulating or unpacking the sort of intersection of military and war and ethics and so on. I think the key part here is perhaps we should avoid simplifying, even though I've been doing this for the last 10 minutes. But we need to look at all these games sort of individually, and I think a lot of our talks today have done that, where we get a more subtle, nuanced examination of a specific game and seeing how, even Call of Duty, which everybody is like, that's a whipping boy of doing it wrong, right? There are moments where there are, scenes and moments in these games which are really interesting from an ethical perspective, right? Yes, there is the I'm wounded and crawling out of the helicopter scene in, was it Modern Warfare 2? 1? 3 has the moment where you're a civilian, you're a tourist in London, and you're seeing this sort of explosion happen. And it gives you a very different sense of, oh man, I failed to stop the terrorist attacks, which you've been trying to do earlier in the game, okay? So I'm not by any stretch of imagination under the assumption that I have sort of covered this thoroughly. This is basically an overview. We're scratching the surface. And there's additional concerns, right? I've just looked at games, right, and give you an idea. Like if you just look at games, there's all these alternatives. But looking at the context of production of games, so this notion of the military entertainment complex and the role that it plays, media effects research is an entirely different angle to look at it. Modes of consumption and play. What do players understand? What do they feel? Marketing issues too. How are these games sold and what's the message? Just yesterday, I bought a game at the store down at the mall, and it's sort of a silly game, and the back of the word says, oh, and this game is about holy war. I was like, whoa, that's like a pretty heavy phrase to use to describe a game, and they're using it in a very sort of light-hearted way. So like, oh, it's a holy war, because, it's sort of like, let's play football, it's a holy war. And you sort of realize that perhaps the way we are marketing, right, or selling our games or providing them is also a rhetoric, right, which needs to be questioned or needs to be examined, right? Do we use this term war too lightly, perhaps? So I wanted to leave you sort of as a final thought with words that are used throughout each and every one of these games that are coming up here. War never changes. If you play these games, you're familiar with that. The infamous Ron Perlman. So even if war never changes, that doesn't mean that video games shouldn't, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to get them to change or to give us more variety, because games can change, and they will, and it ultimately is sort of up to us to ask these questions and explore these issues and maybe vote with our wallets, but also, vote with our voices and make ourselves known that, I do appreciate them making a game where you are a civilian and you have to sort of go through that. And I think that's interesting, and we need more of that. So that would be my final call. And thank you very much. I appreciate your questions and your time.